Historical chronicles. In the prologue to one of the plays that were going on in London in 1599, three allegorical figures appeared on the stage: a comical sight comedy, a gloomy tragedy with a whip in one hand and a dagger in another, and a solemn story with a banner and a drum. The Shakespearean theatre distinguished three kinds of plays. Tragedy, comedy and historical chronicle came to replace the theatre of the Middle Ages. We touched on the brightest, sunny comedies of Shakespeare. In addition to the play, Henry VIII, which in the main belongs, according to the latest scholars, the pen of Fletcher, as well as plays King John, whose action takes place at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries. The historical chronicles of Shakespeare describe events dating back to the 14th century and to the 15th century. These chronicles constitute a single majestic epic. In order to feel its unity more clearly, it is necessary to reread the chronicles in the order in which Shakespeare wrote them: Henry VI, Richard III, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V. The main political theme of this epic is the consolidation of the country under the authority of the monarch, fighting on the one hand against the reactionary feudal lords, Henry IV on the other, against the external enemy, Henry V. The epic commemorates the triumph of Henry V., whom Shakespeare paints as the ideal monarch from his point of view. On the night before the battle, when the leaders of the hostile French army brag about armor and war horses, Henry goes around his camp and talks with simple soldiers. The king, he says, is the same person as other people. The violet smells for him, the elements act on him, his feelings are ordinary human feelings. Take away the king's ceremonial, and in his nakedness he will be just a man, says Heinrich. If the knight of the ancient feudal warehouse, Henry Percy, nicknamed Hotspurs, seeks honor and glory only for himself and does not want to have rivals, King Henry seeks honor and glory for his entire army. All those who fight it against a common enemy, including simple shooters Iamenov, are his brothers. This close to the people king, as Shakespeare draws it, is modest and simple in his treatment of people. If you had a better understanding of English, he says to his fiancée, the French princess, I would find that I am a very simple king and would have thought that I sold the farm to buy a crown. I do not know how to explain gracefully in love. I can only just say, I love you. Give me the answer, on the hands, and the deal is concluded. Well, what do you say, lady? Chronicles of Shakespeare are of exceptional interest for studying the development of the genre of historical drama. Shakespeare in his chronicles tried to truthfully portray the past. The sources of Shakespeare were the chronicles of Holinshed and Stowe, where the truth was mixed with the legend. He also used the historical plays of his predecessors and an oral tradition. What Shakespeare learned from these sources, he tried to convey truthfully. For example, Prince Henry, the future King Henry V, in his youth patronized the Lollards, these early predecessors of the Protestants. Having ascended the throne, he became a zealous champion of the Catholic Church and mercilessly pursued heretics. The Catholic chroniclers have created a legend, according to which the prince was at first a dissolute reveler, but, having become king, he became on the path of virtue. Shakespeare, like his contemporaries, took this legend to faith and reflected it in his historical play, Henry IV. Deviations from historical truth have never been conscious in Shakespeare. He did not confuse the truth with fiction, as, for example, Schiller did, who composed the circumstances of Joan of Arc's death, bypassing the fire in which she was actually burned. Without mixing the truth with fiction, Shakespeare as if puts them side by side, with each other. So did the Leo Tolstoy, who, for example, in War and Peace forced Kutuzov, a historical image, to communicate with Andrei Bolkonsky, a fictional image. The fictitious person thereby acquires in the eyes of the reader the credibility of reality, truth. We know that there was Kutuzov, and we begin to believe that there was also Andrei Bolkonsky. For his part, the historical person, communicating with the fictional, in the creation of which the author's creative imagination was not constrained by precise historical facts, dates and documentary data, acquires a particularly vivid artistic conviction. A remarkable example of this method is Henry IV, the most significant of Shakespeare's historical plays, where we find the complete balance of two principles: historical truth, as Shakespeare knew it, and artistic fiction. Prince Henry, a historical person, and Sir John Falstaff, a fictional image. Chronicles of Shakespeare can be called historical only with a very substantial caveat. Writers of that time did not yet know that in the course of historical development people's world outlook, their psychology, attitude towards each other are changing. People who act in the historical chronicles of Shakespeare are the people of Elizabethan England. Not only their thoughts, feelings, attitude to life and to each other, but their clothes themselves belong to the England of the Shakespeare era. So in the plays of Shakespeare from the times of ancient Rome, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra, before us there are people born under the sky of the Shakespearean era. Shakespeare also did not take into account the archaeological details, which outraged the scientist Ben Jonson. In Julius Caesar, mention of the Battle of the Clock, although in ancient Rome there was no mechanical clock, time was recognized by the sun, sand and water clock. Julius Caesar speaks of his coat. Roman plebeians wear caps, like English masters and apprentices of the 16th century. And yet Shakespeare, with ingenious insight, already guessed the significance of the historical process. In Henry IV, the rebellious lords suffer one defeat after another not because they lack courage. On the contrary, Henry Percy and Douglas are distinguished by desperate courage, but because time is against them. "Oh, my good Lord Mowbray," says Westmoreland, "understand the necessity of time, and you will then say that it is not the king, but time is doing you a defeat." But this sense of history, of course, does not exclude the fact that the persons who act in the chronicles belong first of all to the Shakespearean era. The most valuable thing for us is that these are living people, each with his own character. They are in front of us as part of a huge picture. This canvas is striking in size and variety. The feeling of the enormity of life and its diversity is what we take first of all from the reading of Shakespeare's chronicles. "This huge world," says one of the choirs in the chronicles. Especially significant in this respect is the chronicle, Henry IV. Here, and the magnificent royal court, where the dying old king languishes with anguish, and the tavern, Crabania Head, where the lively young prince in Falstaff society is having fun, and the elegant castle of Henry Percy, a brilliant young knight and brave man, and a gloomy castle, the old Earl of Northumberland, where the stones themselves are eaten up by worms, and the modest courtyard of a roadside hotel in Rochester, where the drivers who have got up early in the morning are getting ready for the day and scolding the shoddy night. Among the diverse characters are striking and frenzied in their reckless bravery Scotsman Count Douglas and the old Welsh feudal Owen Glendower, full of bizarre superstitions of grey-haired Celtic antiquity, and comic provincial gentleman Shallow. And again we return to the image of the fat knight of Sir John Falstaff bathed in bright sunshine. Among the characters created by Shakespeare, Sir John Falstaff occupies one of the most prominent places. Someone called it Hamlet. On the contrary, Falstaff, as it were, embodies the rejoicing flesh of the Renaissance, freed from the chains of ascetic medieval ideals and at the same time protesting against the dry and hard moral code that at that time the Puritans were already creating for the glory of all the future, self-respecting and honorable bourgeois English gentlemen. Falstaff is boundlessly merry. "We young people," he says, although he has already been many in 50 years. Only occasionally, and even then mostly in moments of lack of money, finds sadness on him, and then he sits motionless, like a melancholy cat. But the anguish passes from him instantly. Like a light cloud, to the devil of care and size, he says, they inflate a person like a gut. In this huge mountain of meat insatiable belly, Falstaff drinks at dinner 2 gallons sherry. Sherry! Exclaims Falstaff. He has a double effect on a man. His vapors rise to the brain, they drive a dull boredom without a trace. The mind becomes receptive, quick, capable of forgetting insults, full of light, fiery, delightful images. The second property of sherry is to warm the blood. Cold blood and pale liver, a sign of cowardice, turn into fire. The person's face becomes fiery and, as a signal fire, calls all subjects of this small kingdom, called a person, to arms, and forming the person, unite around their boss, the heart, and this chief, leading such a valiant army, is ready to perform any brave feat. If I had 1,000 sons, the first rule I would have inspired them would be that they stop drinking beer and switch to sherry. Gallon 4.54 liters. We quote the famous Falstaff monologue about sherry in our translation. Falstaff is not just a cheerful person. He is a source of fun for everyone around him. I'm not only witty on my own, he says, but the reason is that there's wit in other people. Falstaff, despite all his victories, is a big child. His death, which is mentioned in Henry V, is almost poetic. I would like to be with him, says his henchman, the red-faced Bardolph, wherever he is now, in hell or in paradise. No, he is not in hell, replies Mrs. Quigley, he is in the bosom of King Arthur. His end was beautiful, he died like an innocent child. He died between the 12 and the hour when the sea began to set in. When I saw that he touches the sheets, plays with flowers and smiles, looking at the tips of his fingers, I realized that there was one end, for his nose became sharp, like a goose quill, and he started chattering about the green fields. What would buy you, Sir John? I said. Cheer up, old man, God, my God, my God. He exclaimed 3 or 4 times. I felt his feet, they were colder than stone, he was colder than stone. The death of Falstaff is the beginning of the ebb of that great sea of superabundant human forces, violent, indomitable passions, hot feelings, which we call the Renaissance. Fat Knight moved into the bosom of King Arthur, into the bosom of a folk tale. Falstaff, who was played on the stage of the Globe William Kemp, had a huge success with the audience, and when he appeared on stage, the theatre's London apprentices, like a contemporary tells, even the nuts stopped cracking.